Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. Mark Cuban, entrepreneur and investor, weighing in on Kamala Harris's race for the White House.
I told her team, look, put my name in for the SEC. It needs to change.
And the taxing issues grabbing attention, even as the details are still coming together.
It takes a lot more than the 40 days that she's been in this position to turn things around. It's not like we've heard the Starbucks new CEO come out with every plan, and said everything that they're going to do. It takes time to pull these pieces together.
And Airbnb co-founder Joe Gebbia's new gig, building tiny houses.
A casita, a granny flat, a backyard home, a guest house.
Will it solve the housing affordability crisis? Plus, Nvidia knocking down rumors, the steel deal that may not happen, and just what economic issues will change voters' minds. 61 days till Election Day.
You could tell me just about anything would happen, and I would believe that at this point.
It's Thursday, September 5th. Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick along with Andrew Ross Sorkin. Joe is out today. He's feeling a little under the weather.
Meantime, Nvidia denying reports yesterday that it received a subpoena from the U.S. Justice Department. A spokesman for the company sending a comment and statement to Jim Kramer regarding the antitrust concerns, saying, quote, Nvidia wins on merit as reflected in our benchmark results and value to customers, and customers can choose whatever solution is best for them. We have inquired with the U.S. Department of Justice and have not been subpoenaed. Nonetheless, we're happy to answer any questions regulators may have about our business. Shares of that stock up, but not up so much on the back of that news. I don't know if that means that people don't believe that there's not a subpoena in the works or that there's some other kind of thing. Or does it really mean that the stock never moved the first time around on the back of the subpoena?
Because all of that stuff happened before the subpoena news was reported by Bloomberg. And that had a lot of people wondering, well, was that news leaked? Yesterday we were asking, was that
was the big question, whether it was leaked.
Maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe it was something more broad because, again, I was looking at the action on that. And with Nvidia shares down, that would make sense on the subpoena. But all of their competitors, you think, would have gone up on it. But what really happened in trading was all the stocks.
Everybody got right.
Yeah,
it was a washout.
Kind of knocked down with all of those issues. So we're watching this very closely. Again, the pushback coming from that. I was listening a little to Bloomberg this morning, and I think they were saying, well, maybe regulators were asking questions, and sometimes that's called a subpoena. But it sounded like they were backtracking around some of those issues too. We also have some breaking news right now. Verizon is buying Frontier Communications in a $20 billion all-cash deal that combines the top cell phone carrier by subscribers with the broadband provider to about 3 million locations in 25 states. Frontier shares closed up by 38% in yesterday's session after the Wall Street Journal reported on those deal talks. You can see right now Frontier Communications off by about 5.6%. But again, that comes after a huge jump yesterday of about 28% for those shares. Been a lot of questions about what they would do next with fiber. There have been some deals that have come in the fiber space to try and increase the fiber connectivity because getting data places is so important, and it's pretty expensive to do, either to build it out or to buy it. We've seen some more deals recently. Frontier Communications has run into some trouble in the past, even potential bankruptcy, but we'll see.
That's going to be, I think, one of the central questions on this deal. And it would be shocking if there wasn't a subpoena, not a subpoena, but an investigation of this transaction.
Shares of U.S. Steel plunging by more than 17% yesterday. That comes after a Washington Post report said that President Biden was preparing to announce that he will block the company's planned sale to Japan's Nippon Steel. That deal has been under review by CFIUS, that's the Committee on Foreign Investment. A company spokesperson said that U.S. Steel has not received any update or executive order related to the committee's review. President Biden, Vice President Harris, and former President Trump have all said that U.S. Steel should remain a U.S.-owned company. The company has pushed back and said that if this deal is not allowed to go through, they may have to shutter some plants and move their headquarters from Pittsburgh. So you don't know how much of a bluff that is, what's happening with any of this, but you can see right now shares of U.S. Steel down about 21% for the week to date, right now up by 1.8%.
Here's the thing. It's just not right that those who can most afford it are often paying a lower tax rate than our teachers and our nurses and our firefighters. It's just not right. It's just not right. So that's why I support a billionaire minimum tax and corporations paying their fair share.
Vice President Harris announcing her plans to raise the capital gains rate, but she's broken with President Biden by proposing a smaller top rate. In a speech that she made in New Hampshire, Harris proposed an all-in top rate of 33%. That includes a new 28% capital rate, as well as Biden's proposal to raise a 3.8% investment income tax to 5%. Now, President Biden had proposed nearly doubling today's capital gains rate of 23.8% to a top rate of what they were calling 44.6%. Harris did not say whether her proposal would differ from President Biden's on taxing unrealized gains, which is something we've debated at this table of folks with high net worths. We'll probably hear more about that over the next couple of weeks. But Robert Frank's got a lot more on the new tax proposal a little bit later this hour, and we're going to talk about it. But I do think, to some extent, remember, we've been talking again over the last couple of weeks here about this idea that she may be trying to move either more to the center on some economic policy, and was she really going to do that, and what does that look like? And I think this is a little bit of that.
I think that this will actually calm the nerves of a lot of investors. They may not see eye to eye, and I'm sure they want to see a lot more of the other proposals that come with this, but that's a big deal. And the way she explained it yesterday, I think, was important, too. She laid it out and said that if you are incentivizing people to invest back in the economy, that helps the economy, it helps jobs, it helps down the road. And that's certainly the type of thinking that investors and business leaders would look at it with a more open eye. If you are raising the taxes on that, you are not investing people to put back in. And it's all the
Well, by the way, the truth is that, unless you have the Senate and the House at the same time, it's unlikely any of these things happen all at one time anyway.
Right.
That's
but
look,
I don't think you can look at any poll and know whether it's going to be a sweep one direction or the other way. You could tell me just about anything would happen, and I would believe that at this point. And it was interesting to me to actually hear her reasons around why she would lower the tax increase from what Biden had proposed. Just thought it was, first time I'd heard her say something along those lines.
Cheese will be next.
Coming up next on Squawk Pod, Vice President Kamala Harris has revealed new details about her tax plans, and they're a little different from President Biden's. Robert Frank helps us do the math.
I've seen conflicting reporting on that, so
where it ends up being 33%, or it ends up being 28%.
28.
31, because there's already
31.8 because they keep the 3.
It's complicated. Investor and entrepreneur Mark Cuban called us to say it's okay to not have all the details ironed out just yet.
She's open-minded. She's not an ideologue. She wants to do what's best for business. To answer your question directly, when is the right time to have the details and how much time do we need? Look, if it's 2 weeks, if it's 30 days, we're smart enough to figure out what the tax implications are before we walk into a ballot booth.
You're listening to Squawk Pod from CNBC.
Please join us in welcoming to New Hampshire next President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
So here's the detail. If you earn $1 million a year or more, the tax rate on your long-term capital gains will be 28% under my plan, because we know when the government encourages investment, it leads to broad-based economic growth and it creates jobs, which makes our economy stronger.
Here's Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Welcome back to Squawk Box. Vice President Harris breaking with President Biden in her new tax proposal, suggesting a capital gains hike that would be far less than Biden had proposed. Robert Frank's at the table this morning. He joins us with the latest. Robert.
Good morning, Andrew. Lots of twists and turns in taxes on the campaign trail. Vice President Harris calling for a 33% tax on long-term gains. That would be higher than the current rate of 23.8%, but it is lower than the 44.6% rate that was proposed by Biden and that she endorsed before the convention. Now, under her plan, Long-term gains would be taxed at 28%. She would then raise the net investment income tax to 5% from the current 3.8%. That would create that combined total rate of 33% on long-term capital gains. Now, it would apply to those with income, including a capital gain of more than $1 million in 1 year. It would be the highest rate since 1978. Now, in New York, the combined state, city, and federal tax would be 48%. In California, just over 47%. Now, she has not announced any changes to her plan to tax unrealized capital gains. Gotten a lot of discussion at this table for those worth more than $100 million. Wealthy donors have been pressuring her campaign to lower the capital gains tax and reject that tax on unrealized gains. All of them were part of that 2024 White House budget, which she endorsed. Now, for a lot more on what the wealthy are being taxed and where they're spending and where they're investing, you can go to CNBC/Inside Wealth. CNBC, we have that full screen. Maybe not. We'll show it later.
What percentage of Americans do you think will be impacted by this? Because only 1% of Americans at the moment even pay the highest tax rate at 37%.
Right. So, and 0.1% of Americans get about half of the total capital gains. So capital gains as a whole is very skewed toward the very top. Now, in terms of how many make in any 1 year income more than $1 million, including capital gains, it's probably a very thing. But you are reducing the revenue you're getting. When she went from 44.6 to 33, we'll have to see how it scores. But she had a lot of spending proposals in that budget that she has endorsed. And since then, she's added more tax cuts, including on small businesses, including tax exempting tip wages. But I think Becky's point was very important this morning when she said it was as much about the messaging as it was the numbers. The first time I've heard her say, we want to tax capital gains to reward innovators, founders, and small businesses.
I wasn't sure she believed that. I'm still not sure, because she was also using the number 28%. She said specifically in that speech, if you make over $1 million, you're not going to pay more than 28%. As you point out, it is 33%. It's the highest that we've ever seen.
Right. And it was a little unclear going into that speech and even out of it whether that 3.8 to 5%, whether it was going to be, and I've seen conflicting reporting on that. So
where it ends up being 33%,
right,
or it ends up being 28%,
28, or maybe 31.8.
31 because there's already
31.8 because they keep the 3. But it was clearly her donors. I've heard, I know, Andrew, you've been talking to a lot of the tech titans, a lot of pushback from donors saying, look, we want to support you as a moderate, as a pro-business person. So you get this unrealized gains and a capital gains rate of 44.6, but you got to come down on that. And I think she's listening to them. Getting a lot of pushback from the progressives of the party, however.
Now, one other point, and I know it's a little bit of a curveball, but I want to go back to yesterday because you sent me an email after our segment about where we're talking about unrealized gains, and then the conversation veered towards philanthropy and how oftentimes folks donate shares, unrealized gain shares, where they have a small basis to a charity. The charity turns around, sells the stock, and the gain.
It never gets taxed.
Gain has never been taxed.
Never been taxed.
And I'd said, and Rokan had said, well, maybe at some point, if it's over $1 million a year or $5 million of donations a year or some kind of number, then maybe there should be some kind of tax so that there's some kind of realization event. Otherwise, you're subsidizing the philanthropy. You made a very interesting point, which I think the viewers should know about.
Well, I think the inequity of when you're giving some kind of, whether it's stock or some asset to charity, getting a full deduction on that.
Right. So this is the piece that to me, that was very interesting. The idea that not only are you not realizing the tax gain, but you're actually also using it as a deduction against real gains.
So the Robert Frank tax proposal here would be that you can only get a deduction for whatever your basis in that stock or asset. So let's say Warren Buffett, his basis in a stock was $1 million. He donates $10 billion to a foundation. Right now, you get a $10 billion deduction. My view is he should only get a deduction for what he paid or what his basis was. So I think that takes the burden less off the taxpayers of America that are then not subsidizing a $10 billion deduction. You can only do a third of it, but still. And so the deduction is only in the basis. And I think that you could still encourage charity and charitable contribution, which we need in this country.
Right. I don't think you want to discourage that.
But you don't get the full deduction.
Because we use the tax code to incentivize all types of behavior. I think incentivizing people to give to philanthropy is a worthwhile cause. Now, you can make the argument that let's get rid of any incentivizations. I'm okay with that, too. If you want to make it a really simple tax code and not find ways to play around with it, that would cut cheating out, that would cut any of those things. But we have, for forever, used the tax code to incentivize behavior for everything, for trying to convince people to buy houses, to send kids to school, to reward GIs who come back after doing service. I think philanthropy would land in the things that you want to incentivize society to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And all of this is going to be subject to a huge congressional fight, probably coming up next year.
Robert Frank, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Smart stuff. We got a special guest joining us by phone right now. Talk about the Harris tax plan. Dallas Mavericks owner, investor, Mark Cuban. Mark, it's great to have you on the program. I know you've been outspoken on Twitter and X on this issue, and I'm glad you're going to hopefully be outspoken right here on Squawk about this particular plan. I'm curious both what your take is on the tax plan itself as it relates to capital gains, what you've been hearing from other entrepreneurs and investors, and then maybe we can get into some of the debate about unrealized gains as well.
Sure. Well, let me talk about the process, because I think that's the most important element here when it comes to the vice president's tax approach. You know, I've talked to the Biden administration, I've talked to the Trump administration, I've talked to the Obama administration, and I think the Harris administration has been most open. I mean, they've been very clear to me and other business people that, look, we've realized that rich people have to pay their fair share, but we don't have all the answers. So, Mark and others, what do you think is the best approach to taxing wealthy people so that they pay their fair share to help contribute to reducing the deficit, and we can come up with some new ideas? And let me just tell you, I probably talk to them, and I know others do as well, 3-4 times a week about what's the best approach to taxing the wealthy and increasing revenues and cutting costs for that matter.
So what did you tell them originally? What do you think the right rate for capital gains should be?
Well, you know, you heard her in her speech yesterday. She said that, billionaires should pay more than, the average working people, firefighters, et cetera. And if you just look at the numbers, right, if a firefighter or someone who's working their butt off is making, $150,000 a year, they're paying 24%. And she came out yesterday and said 28% for capital gains, which when I talked to them, I thought was fair. Now, the next question is, does it include the ACA hickey, right? Does it include the extra 3.8%? And they didn't commit to a number to me, but what they told me is they expected it to end up with a 2 handle.
Well, but 3.8% potentially going to 5% is what some places are reporting. So 28% sounds fair to you, Mark. Does 33% sound fair if that's what it ends up being? If we're still talking about numbers that we don't quite know.
Yeah, I agree with you. 33% is not right. And again, I'm not committing what the final number is going to be, but every conversation I've had, including up to yesterday after her speech, was that it was going to end up with the 2 handle.
Let me ask you a broader question, Mark. A lot of folks have come on our broadcast who are critical of the vice president and her campaign have suggested that she's a progressive and that she is going to operate very similarly to Biden, or in some cases, people have suggested she's going to operate even to more to the left of Biden as it relates to regulation, potentially taxes, other things related to business. On the other side, you hear, at least privately, from folks in and around the Biden campaign saying, no, we're really tacking to the middle. What do you think is really happening here?
Kamala Harris is pro-business. This is Kamala Harris's campaign. It's not Joe Biden's campaign, right? Kamala Harris is not Joe Biden. They're very, very different. She's trying to be, again, this is my perspective, she's trying to be very respectful of the president and everything he's proposed. She's trying not to directly contradict him in any way. So she talks a little bit around the subject when it comes to taxing in particular, but she's going center 100%. I mean, literally, if you read the transcript of her speech yesterday, she's talked more about entrepreneurs and helping them have access to investment and making it easier for people to invest in startups than any president that I've ever heard talk about startups and entrepreneurs.
So to the extent
literally, she listens, right? This is not something where it's just her policy team comes out and says, Mark, or whoever, let's hope this works. No, she's like, list me things you think we should be talking about. You're the entrepreneur. You invest in more startups than anybody I know. What do you think we should be doing, and what's going to increase the number of investments in startups? And I've had other conversations with their team where it's like I literally go through and say the higher the capital gains tax, the more difficult it is to invest in riskier investments. Right. And the people who have the hardest time getting risk capital are women, people of color, young kids that are coming out of colleges. Exactly. The people you want to take risk on, the higher the cap gains rate, the harder it is to invest in them for obvious reasons. And they understand that, and they've adapted as a result.
Mark, if people are policy, what are the kinds of people you think she's ultimately going to appoint to her cabinet and around her? And I'm thinking of a Treasury Secretary. I'm thinking of
I have no idea.
Folks who are going to run commerce. But I think it's an important question. I think it's a question about who's going to run the FTC, who's going to run antitrust for the DOJ. I mean, do you get a sense? And I think one of the critiques has been that the Biden administration did not surround itself with virtually anybody from the private sector.
Right. I agree with you 100%. So two things. One, I told her team, look, put my name in for the FCC. It needs to change. And two, that I've strongly suggested that she put together a multi-level business advisory group. And they said, once we get past the debate, it's something we're going to look very strongly at. And when the details of that I suggested were, one, you have small entrepreneurs and just a council of those types of business people. Two, medium-sized companies, because they have different issues than smaller, larger. And then, the big companies, because they're going to have a completely different perspective. Because the advisory groups that I've been on, there's a whole wide range of people, and it's hard for anybody to come to an alignment because we all have different priorities. But by having this three-tier council, and again, these are just conversations I'm having. I'm not committing to anything for them, but they're very open to them. Hey, Mark, I can't stress enough that they always say, give us your ideas. Give us your ideas. And when I talk to other business people, they're saying the same thing. Right. She's literally having conversations.
That's a distinction.
But can I ask, Mark, I think it's a little crazy that we're like 60 days out, 2 months until we get to Election Day. And there aren't details around either of these candidates' plans to any certain extent. We're talking about this today. You called in. We ask you all the time to come on. You say, no, no, no. I'm guessing you called in this morning because you're interested in what you're hearing about finally starting to put a little bit of meat on the bones. But we still don't even know the number. We don't know if it's 28 or 33% for the capital gains when you include the other tax that's part of that. We're guessing around the edges. You think 28% would be okay and 33% would not be okay. And both of these candidates seem to be at the point where they're basically promising lots of things to lots of people without trying to figure out ways to pay for it. They both agree in some crazy places, whether that be we're not going to tax tips anymore, whether that's we're going to, just the number of things that they actually agree on, whether it's the Nippon Steel deal. They agree on a lot of things. Where they are differentiated, it's hard to get real details on any of these things, and we're 60 days away. So in a lot of ways, I think Americans are kind of being asked to give it a flyer, and we'll go with our best guess on things.
Well, a couple things. One, if you've ever taken over a company that was floundering, let's say the CEO got fired and you had to step in, it takes a lot more than the 40 days that she's been in this position to turn things around. It's not like we've heard the Starbucks new CEO come out with every plan, and said everything that they're going to do. It takes time to pull these pieces together. To go from 0 to 100 miles an hour is not easy. So that's first and foremost the most important. And second, she's not just behind the scenes. She is working on the details to determine how we can reduce the deficit. Obviously, if interest rates go down, that'll help a lot. But more importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we're having conversations. Like some of the things that I've discussed with her team that they haven't said no to, but things like a higher tax rate on stock buybacks, which I'm a fan of, right? Because I think that's financial engineering. But depending on where you take that, where does that lead, right? So if you increase the tax on stock buybacks to 3%, 4%, which some people may think is high, then what are the downstream impacts? Well, if you do that, maybe companies will start paying dividends more. Well, then there's the issue of double taxation. So right now, dividends are exempt up to $89,000 for a couple filing jointly. Well, what if you increase that to $250,000 or $400,000? Now, all of a sudden, you change the way economics work for a lot of people, right? So now you're probably going to get more people buying shares of stock and as a result, getting more dividends and then paying taxes on those. And then, let's do the math to see what happens to the deficit and how much revenue that can increase. Great. The other conversation is taxing people borrowing against liquid assets or even illiquid assets. Well, the conversation I told them, and this is my feedback to them, when interest rates were low, a lot of people were doing that because it was a great arb. It was a domestic carry trade, if you will. Borrow at 2% and invest in a bond at 4% or 5%. Because interest rates are higher, that's not going to generate as much revenue, but it's a conversation you need to have, et cetera. So, Becky, to your point, she's not publishing a lot of details because she's still trying to flesh out what all the details should be.
Mark,
the great part of the conversation is she's not jumping. She's not ideological about this at all. She's like, what is the best way to approach increasing the amount of investment, taxing people fairly so you don't reduce investment, and reducing the deficit? You got to get to the details, Becky, before you can just throw out policies just to make people happy by throwing out policies.
Mark, speak to the unrealized, speak to the unrealized tax gain issue, which is to the extent that she, at least as of now, to the extent that she's sticking with any of the Biden plan, there would be a wealth tax effectively on some of the wealthiest Americans in the country, over $100 million.
Yeah, every conversation I've had is that it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Again, I'm not speaking for, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to speak for the vice president. She makes the final decision. Again, I'm talking to these folks 3-4 times a week, having back and forth conversations, and their verbatim words to me is, that's not where we want to go. We need to find alternative sources of revenue, things I've just spoken about, and those alternative sources of revenue are meant to replace what the unearned income, the unrealized gains tax from the Biden plan would have implemented.
What do you say? There's a whole bunch of folks in the Valley who I've been in touch with in the past week on this unrealized tax issue, gain issue, and where we've talked about, those who are taking loans against their unrealized stock, et cetera, et cetera. And then they say, well, if you start to tax that, we won't be able to make investments in startups. We won't be able to give money over to venture capitalists and private equity folks and other things like that. What's your feedback to that distinction? Because I wonder, once there's a critique of one, then of one policy, and you get rid of that policy, then of course it moves to the critique of the next version of it.
Well, of course, but okay. So what I told him was, if you tax unrealized gains, you're going to kill the stock market, right? And it's going to be the ultimate employment plan for private equity, because companies are not going to go public because you can get whipsawed, right? I mean, my own personal experience back from the internet days, right? All of a sudden I was cash poor, but equity rich, right? My net worth was enormous, but the number of dollars in the bank wasn't enormous. And so I'd have to, based off of the unrealized gains, I would have had to borrow money, and I effectively would have been in hock just to pay my tax bill instead of trying to run my company, and 1,000 other reasons, right? So they realized that's the issue. I can't repeat it enough. Even though she's not directly conflicting the Biden tax plan, to her value proposition is, we need to tax everybody fairly. I'm starting from the Biden plan as a starting point, but that's not necessarily her ending
Mark,
point.
let me just say, I appreciate you calling in, telling us what you're hearing on these fronts. That's great. But as you've said yourself, you can't speak for the vice president. These are things they're telling you. Who knows what they're telling other people? My guess is they're telling anybody who's donating to them exactly what they want to hear at this point. What matters is what they say publicly and what they will stick to.
No, absolutely, positively not. Right. Let me just be very
I don't know.
clear.
Why do you think that they're telling you the truth and not telling other people other things?
Well,
if they won't say it publicly, say it publicly. Tell all of us so that we can hold you to it.
I get it, but you got to get the details right. You can't just.
Yeah, but we have 60 days till an election. Like, you're asking people to take a flyer.
Even if it's the day before the election, right? Even if it's the day before. Look, the next question is, the second thing I was going to mention it earlier.
I just don't want everybody to trade on what we think and what we feel and what we think may happen.
Exactly.
Just tell us.
I get your point exactly, right? But again, like any good CEO, you got to do it when you get it right. Not because, your customer is screaming or yelling, well, we're waiting on the new pricing for the SaaS program. No, let me get it right.
Yeah, but I'm not going to buy the product until you tell me what the product is.
Right. So, Mark, here's I think, the fairest question to this. What do you think the fairest timeline is for her to disclose and articulate exactly what the policies are? Meaning, recognizing that she's gotten into this campaign late, I get that piece of it, and the issue of trying to get it right, but also recognizing that the American public needs to understand these issues, hopefully to the best they can, prior to voting. What is a fair amount of time? Would you say 4 weeks? out, 6 weeks out? I mean, we're only 8 weeks out, right? So what's your...
Be brutally honest on what I think on this. Number one, the number of people this truly impacts is less than 1% of the voting population, right? And so this is not number one priority for her. It's not, right, in terms of speaking about it and getting the word out. She wanted to talk about entrepreneurs, startups, founders first. The people like me in my position, we're not at the top of the list. We're closer to the bottom. So we're not going to get that full detailed disclosure first. And I'm okay with that. Now, to your question, how much time is enough time? I mean, 2 weeks? How long does it take for any of us to digest any of this information? You know, and it's the bigger problem is, like when she gives a speech like yesterday, I go through and make sure I read the transcript to make sure I understand what she's trying to say, you know, so I can talk to other people about it. Most people don't. We live in a soundbite world where they, you know, when you talk about what the other guy is doing, everything is a soundbite.
But Mark, I was listening and reading through that speech too, and the speech didn't give all the details. It didn't talk about the extra 5% in tax, which the difference between 28% and 33% is a big deal. That's what I mean.
Right, but for most people, it's not applicable for most people.
But if you're going to say that you believe in creating jobs and doing these things, show us the details. Right. And by the way, Donald Trump is going to have to show us the details too. He's speaking at the Economic Club in New York today, and we're going to be taking close notes on all of this. My problem is none of these candidates are. I'm not.
I agree with.
Go ahead.
I'm not trying to disagree with you that details are important, right? I'm trying to say, like any good CEO trying to turn around a battleship, right? There's only so much you can do every single day. And the point I'm really trying to convey is she's open-minded. She's not an ideologue. She wants to do what's best for business. To answer your question directly, when is the right time to have the details and how much time do we need? Look, if it's 2 weeks, if it's 30 days, we're smart enough to figure out what the tax implications are before we walk into a ballot booth.
Hey, Mark,
but what's more important is for the other 99%.
Mark, a broader question then for the other 99%, which is one of the other big critiques, is that she, while she's speaking at a lot of these rallies and she's now conducted one interview, she's not out there sitting for interviews where people can ask her critical questions and she can answer them, where she probably would be pressed on some of these kinds of details that we're talking about. And maybe she would have to say, I don't have the details. And maybe the American public would say that's unacceptable. Maybe they'd say, that's okay, tell us 2 weeks beforehand. I don't know what would be the answer. But do you believe it's incumbent upon her to be more out there, not in the rally context, but in the interview context where she is asked these questions in a meaningful way and provide the American public the same kind of access that you seem to have?
So what I would say is the first thing she's got to do, I always try to put this in context of being a CEO of a big company, right? And she just took over. The first thing she's got to do is introduce herself to all the voters. Not everybody knows who she is. As the vice president, she was, second fiddle, period, end of story. Right. It was her job to implement what somebody else wanted her to implement, or just to carry the message that was initiated by somebody else. So her first role is to go out there and introduce herself to as many voters as we possibly can by giving speeches, obviously in swing states where people can see what she's about, what she's like, and what she has to say. And so that's first and foremost. Once she gets, to a point where, we think she thinks she's introduced herself, people know who she is, then she probably will do more interviews again. But it's not us that she's trying to introduce herself to, right? It's not the people that pay attention to this on a day-to-day basis. It's everyday people who are living their lives and just going through their days that she's got to introduce herself to. And I think that is far more important. I'll add one other thing that might be counterintuitive to people. Donald Trump taught us a lot about how to win an election in 2016. He taught us that the old school way of politics did not work. He told us that you need to go out there and communicate and talk to people. And it's not like when he goes, and even when he gives an interview, he gets into details like you were saying, Becky, but he communicates. He's out there talking all the time. Biden won in 2020 by being kind of old school. But in today's election in 2024, you've got to learn from what worked for Donald Trump. And I think she has. where it's you go out, you communicate to as many people as possible, as broadly as possible, so you can connect to them on a visceral basis, because I personally think that the foundation to who wins this election is who do voters trust more? Which candidate do you trust more, right? And communicating and introducing yourself, like introducing your company, is what matters. And she's got to get out there and talk to as many people as possible, just like Donald Trump has done forever. And I think she's learned that, and I think that's what she's doing.
Mark Cuban, thank you for joining us this morning. Really appreciate you calling in, and hope that we can talk more as this campaign continues. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Next on Squawk Pod, tiny homes.
I'd like one for my yard, but not for my neighbor.
The founders of Samara building accessible dwelling units in backyards in the Golden State.
We started in California just because the market's so good for ADUs.
And looking to expand and maybe address housing's affordability with a consumer-focused model that lets the buyer choose.
The size, the footprint, some of the materials, and then we get to work.
This is Squawk Pod. Today with Becky Quick and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
3, 2, 1, cue Andrew.
Welcome back to Squawk Box. One of the leading causes of the housing affordability crisis is a lack of supply, and now a startup born out of Airbnb's design studios building and delivering tiny homes called ADUSs, and we're going to talk about what this really is to customers in California. They're built in the backyards of so many homes, the aim of creating extra space, multi-generational living, or potentially rental income. And joining us right now is Joe Gebbia, is the co-founder of Samara, also, by the way, co-founder of Airbnb, also on the board of Tesla. Mike McNamara is here, co-founder of and CEO of the company as well. Good morning to both of you guys. So tell us what this is. I mean, I've seen it. It's amazing. These are tiny homes, but they're not that tiny, actually, and they're on your property separately from your actual house.
That's right. Well, Samara's mission is to improve the way people live by reimagining the home. And the way we do that is by designing, manufacturing, and installing ADUs in backyards. Now, ADU stands for Accessory Dwelling Unit. And you probably have seen it before as a casita, a granny flat, a backyard home, a guest house. And this kind of flex space gives people, homeowners, the potential to dream bigger about earning rental income, about housing family, like elderly parents or kids coming in from college.
And how did this started in part because of your experience at Airbnb?
That's right. Yeah, the idea was born when I was leading an innovation team inside Airbnb. And I was actually in the market for a factory-made ADU. And I was incredibly frustrated by the lack of a beautifully designed product that was turnkey for the customer and had an easy way to finance. So Mike and I spun this out of Airbnb, co-founded Samara together to bring our solution to this fast-growing market.
Why didn't Airbnb want to do it?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Airbnb is an incredibly profitable software company.
It's just a different business.
It's a different business.
What's the cost of one of these things?
Well, it depends on what you get. So we have units all the way from 420 square feet all the way up to 950 square feet. It depends how they're configured. There's some configuration options. And typically it ranges anywhere from 250,000 square feet all the way up to 450 or even 500,000 if you get a fully loaded two-bedroom, two-bath.
And most people who are buying these are buying them because they want to turn them into an Airbnb, or most of these people are doing this because they want extra space on their property, either for family members, as an office, as a what?
Yeah, so most people, probably 50% of the people in the demand that we see are people that want to rent them. They don't do them on Airbnb because typically cities don't allow short-term rentals when they're in your backyard. But they do it for long-term rentals, and that's the primary use case that people are putting those in the back.
What's the zoning issues, though, with these things?
That's
what I was going to ask, because people have a certain amount of property. Sometimes you can't build something too close to your neighbor. How does that work?
I'd like one for my yard, but not for my neighbor.
Well, each city and state and municipality will have different rules. What's happened in California, as an example, is they passed all kinds of pro-ADU laws. So it's actually a right.
Because they have such a housing problem.
Because they have such a housing problem. So it's actually a right to have one in your backyard. If you put it 4 feet from the fence, you put it 6 feet from the home, you put it no more than 14 feet high, and you have a right to put them in. So it's basically kind of guaranteed.
Yeah, but I can't even put a fence in my town. We asked, we got denied. So
sometimes the homeowners associations get out of control.
It's not a homeowners association; it's a town. I would think in the Northeast you're going to have bigger problems.
These are pretty complex issues, and homeowners aren't experts in construction, which is why part of our offering is we handle all of that for the customer. We take
So how does this work? So it's literally you go on the website.
You take care of the permit.
And you guys, yes, they're doing all of that. So explain how this works.
Yeah.
Right. So people go to samara.com and you configure your unit. You choose a couple options you can customize: the size, the footprint, some of the materials, and then we get to work. 3 things happen at the same time. We start the production process in the factory. We visit the site and start the land prep in the backyard, which takes about 4 weeks to put a foundation in. And then the third thing is we start the permitting process. And so it's really a hands-off process for the consumer.
How much does it cost me if the permitting doesn't go through? Because I would love one in my backyard. I can't imagine my town would allow me to do it, given the run-ins that I've already had doing simple stuff.
The prices I mentioned is inclusive of all those things. So it's
but what if they turn me down and I can't do it? How much?
So
do
what
I
we
end
do
up
is
paying?
before we start doing the work on the unit, we will go to the city. We'll apply for a permit. We'll do all that for the homeowner. We actually know, because we've been in the business long enough now, that what are the constraints that are going to be in each of the different municipalities and whether or not there are any constraints with homeowners associations.
So right now,
we'll do all that work for you.
Right now, this is just in California.
Correct.
The question is, when does this go national? For those of us on the East Coast, for example, who might want one of these things.
You know, we started in California just because the market's so good for ADUs. People need space. They can't move out of the home. The cost of living's tremendous. If you do it for rental income, you have very high rental income. So we started in California. And the other thing is, in 2016, California started passing pro-ADU regulations. Right. So between 2016 and 2023, the demand for permits, or the increase, has gone up 20x over that very short period, to the point of it's 1 out of 5 of every building permit that gets submitted in California is actually an ADU. So we start in California because the housing crisis is most difficult, it's most acute, the return on investment for rental is highest. And what we've seen is this tremendous adoption of a lot of these ADU laws across the country.
So where do you go next?
Well, you actually saw New Jersey and New York just recently start talking about passing a lot of ADU regulations.
And that's what you would go if they would pass regulations that would make it easier.
So we need to make sure we have the market. We need to make sure we have the right product market fit. It's a little bit different, just in terms of climate that we'd have to deal with out here. The supply chain is a little bit different, and we were waiting for the ADU laws to all adopt. Because like you mentioned, in your property, you can't do it.
I can't do a fence.
So we love the idea of starting in California, really perfecting our model, driving our scale, building our brand, and then kind of heading east.
There's about 8
in the next few years.
Yeah. That's right. There's about 8 states who are modeling California's laws around ADUs as we speak, including New York, New Jersey, and Colorado, and many others. Right. So we'll follow those across the country. It's
crazy to think that you can just buy. It's like what you've done with Tesla. You're on the board of Tesla. You can buy a house on your phone.
The permitting is the biggest issue. You deal with the permitting and getting the land set up.
And we do all that. Yeah. And the other thing, though, that you mentioned Tesla, is we do financing as well. So if you think about really simplifying the process, most people that buy another home for their property need financing. Just like when you go to the car dealer, you go to Tesla and you want to buy a car, you have this amazingly easy process to lease it or to actually finance it. So you have a choice. So we do the same thing. We have our own financing product. We're a licensed mortgage broker, and we'll take you all the way through the financing process. So it's just a very simplified system. And comparing that to building construction and pounding a nail in your backyard one at a time and listening to that for a year, it's an unbelievable process.
Yeah. Joe and Mike want to thank you for coming in. It's fascinating. Congratulations.
They look really nice.
No, they're gorgeous.
Yeah.
The whole thing is gorgeous. It really is the Tesla or Apple of housing. The question is, I don't know if you'll ever build. Will you ever build big homes, or is that just totally out of the question?
Don't rule it out.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's the podcast for today. Thank you for listening. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern. Or get the smartest takes and analysis from our TV show right into your ears when you follow Squawk Pod, wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen anytime. We'll meet you back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.